So, welcome to the latest in our Bible series messages, based on the resources provided by the Bible Society. If you've been with us over the last couple of weeks, you will know that during that time we've covered the start of the Bible by looking at creation and the fall. And then last week, Jenny helped us to look at the exodus of God's people Israel from captivity in Egypt, which basically covers the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. Next week, we're going to be moving on to the New Testament, and that basically means that our task this week is to cover the remaining books of the Old Testament, the remaining 34 of them, from Joshua to Malachi, or if we take things chronologically, from Job to Ezra and Nehemiah. Those of you who studied the Bible Society's Bible course with us a couple of years ago will remember that the author, Andrew Ollerton, had a really helpful visual aid that helped him to summarize the story of the Bible from creation and the fall right through to the hope that the paradise that had been lost at the fall would be regained as God establishes his kingdom in its fullness at the end of time. And of course, he covered everything in between, very briefly, but centering on the life and work of Jesus in rescuing us. Perhaps in summary, the Old Testament can be described as telling the story of how humanity in general, and God's people Israel in particular, constantly went in and out of good relationship with God, time and again aspiring to live in fellowship with and obedience to him, and time and again falling short of the high standards required to live in harmony with a perfect God and even in harmony with each other. We've already thought about the fall, with Adam and Eve being thrown out of their garden paradise. We've touched on the breakdown in relationships in Joseph's family that led to him being taken captive into Egypt, and how his family soon followed, resulting in many years of captivity in Egypt, after which God used Moses to lead them out of Egypt and towards the promised land, a place that God gave them to call home, where they could focus on worshipping him and living well together. Only, surprise, surprise, that's not exactly how it worked out. The rest of the Old Testament tells the story of how Israel first lived under the authority of a series of judges who were called and appointed as God's representatives to ensure that the people obeyed the rules that God gave them through Moses when they left Egypt. And then they decided that they didn't want God as their king, and insisted on having a human king like all the surrounding nations. And so God appointed, first of all, Saul, who started out with good intentions, but eventually fell foul of his pride. And then he appointed David, who had the sort of faith in God that enabled him to slay a giant, and who was described as a man after God's own heart. And yet we know from David's story that he was far from perfect himself. And then David's son Solomon, who, though he showed great wisdom in asking God for wisdom to rule well, just like Saul and David before him, also succumbed to the temptations of power. The nation soon split into two, into a northern and a southern kingdom, and for several hundred years went in and out of relationship with God according to whether they were being led by a good king or a bad king. Eventually, though, God had had enough of their wavering and allowed one of the neighbouring kings, Nebuchadnezzar, to take the southern nation of Judah into captivity in Babylon. And that's what the psalm that we read spoke about. They remained in exile there for 70 years, until Nehemiah was moved to go and investigate how the remnant of his people left behind in Jerusalem were doing, and to go there and inspect and rebuild the broken city walls. And throughout this time of exile, God continued to speak to Israel through the many of the Old Testament prophets, such as Isaiah and Jeremiah. And in fact, this time of exile, of separation from their homeland, acts as a sort of metaphor for all the times of repeated separation from God that Israel had gone through. We know from experience that we are at our happiest, not when we're rich or have everything that we could possibly want, not when we have our own way, often at the expense of others, but when we are deep down at home with God, in right relationship with him and with others, being the people he's called us to be as human beings made in his image. The sense of exile that we have when we are in any way separated from God drives a deep-seated desire to be at peace with him, whether we recognize that for what it is or not. And that is what constantly drew the Israelites back towards God through this Old Testament story of exile and peace, exile and peace. But in their own strength, it was a peace that they struggled to sustain. And it fell far short of the deep, God-given peace that the Hebrew language calls shalom, which, as we've seen in the past, is a prayer of blessing for things to be as they really ought to be.
So we're wondering, how do we identify with this experience of exile? Well, perhaps after so long away from the normal, familiar rhythms of everyday life, we might now be feeling as if we too have been taken from home and left in a place where all the rules are different. Even now, when a return to normal life appeared to be on the horizon, it seemed to have flickered and disappeared like a mirage, so that once again we're left in a place of disappointment and waiting for things to change. Well, I think what Jeremiah wrote to the exiled people of Israel centuries ago can still be really helpful here. These are the words which God gave him for them. God told them to seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. So Jeremiah is effectively saying that if we are in a place where we don't feel at home, we're not supposed to hark back to happier times, but to pray instead for the times we are in, so that they might know God's peace and prosper. Because by so doing, we prosper, or rather, we are blessed too. And that teaching was lived out in practice by people like Daniel and his young friends, who themselves were unwilling exiles in Babylon. They learned the language and the customs of that alien place. They even allowed their names to be changed. And in general, they submitted to the will of the ruler, as long as it did not impact on their worship of God. They seemed to know that if they did the simple things which allowed them to live in peace with others, and if they prayed for them, then the place in which they were exiles would be blessed, and they themselves would be blessed. In other words, they learned to sing the Lord's song, even though they were in a strange land. And although that story happened so many centuries ago, it has enormous potential for us today. Are we waiting for things to return to the way we like them, because we don't like the way we're told to live right now, today? Well, God says pray instead, and work actively for the blessing of those around you. So let's think of the work we do here in Dedworth Green Baptist Church, or which we share with other people in this building and in this community. Well, that work might have been changed by the pandemic, but it's still necessary. So let's get on and do it. Noah's Ark, our toddler group, is currently running with social distancing, and we really thank God for it. It's been a real blessing to us, as well as to the families who are coming. As you know, food shares never stopped, but instead has grown and developed according to need. The carers group has restarted. We know, hallelujah, we can now visit each other. And we can be in church on Sundays. Please remember that our children and young families are still waiting to come back to church. And that's because we need people here to welcome them. I think God has not given us permission to yearn for the past at the expense of the present. In Peter's words, we must learn to live as exiles in a strange land. Now, of course, we hope that this period of exile will soon be over, that these days will finish soon, and that the government will say that we don't need any more regulations, and so on and so on. But let's remember that when Nehemiah and other exiles returned to Jerusalem, the city was no longer the beautiful place that their forefathers had loved. It was in ruins, and it needed to be rebuilt. But with the drive which came from wanting to see their home city fulfilling its purpose again, the whole population worked together to bring it about. Now, I read a brilliant article on Friday which a friend of mine had shared on Facebook. And the writer of this article was trying to encourage people to get back to church. And he said, you can't serve from your sofa. You can't have community of faith on your sofa. You can't experience the power of a room full of believers worshipping together on your sofa. Christians aren't consumers either. We are contributors. We don't watch, we engage. We give, we sacrifice, we encourage. We do life together. The church needs you, and you need the church. Now, I want to confess that personally that deeply challenged me. As I say, I read it on Friday, and the day before at our deacons' meetings, we were discussing whether some of the things we've had to do here are putting you off coming back to church on a Sunday. And we accept wholeheartedly that these are indeed strange times. And what we were specifically wondering was if you were put off by having to pre-register. So, as we are a long way off our capacity for this building, if you forget to pre-book, please don't let that put you off coming, as it's very likely there will still be room for you. Now, to be honest, it does help us a lot to know you are coming so that we can put out seats for you and put them in the right place and properly distanced. But please don't stay away if you suddenly feel that God is prompting you to be here. It's also true that as yet we are not supposed to be singing and we can't serve coffee. And yeah, we do have to wear masks. But I wonder if we accept that this is a time of exile, it will change our perspective on the situation. I think it's worth repeating what that writer said. We are contributors. We don't watch, we engage. We give, we sacrifice, we encourage. And this bit in particular, please, we do life together. Now, we've been saying here for years that at the heart of everything we do lies a community of faith in Jesus. Let's not lose that right now. A community of faith is what Nehemiah and his friends built. We too need to be together because we are the people of God in this place, and he has placed a task on our hearts. It's a task born of love for him, because when we are in relationship with him, our exile is truly over, because we're back where we were always meant to be. Now, next week, Matthew said we're going to be looking at the New Testament, and we're going to be looking at just how God gave us the means to come back into relationship with him. And that's because the hero of the story will arrive, the prince who came to rescue us, the Prince of Peace himself. And that's a story none of us want to miss.
Absolutely. So as we respond to God's challenge to us to find peace with him through Jesus, even while we're in the midst of a sort of exile, let's reflect on the words of a song written in just such a situation. A song that declares by faith that whatever my lot, You've taught me to say, "It is well with my soul."